Welcome to the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity's monthly book seminar series. We host this on books on a wide variety of topics. So most commonly, in line with the core of the Hague Program's work, books usually tend to focus on books that are focused on international cybersecurity. But in recent years, we've expanded the scope of the seminar series to host books on topics as diverse as AI and the future of democracy, influence operations, which of course can be construed as within the remit of cybersecurity. But we address the Brussels effect, which is a book on the data governance landscape evolving in different parts of the world. So the monthly seminar series has a wide remit, and we're very happy to have with us today Lucie Kadlecová, who is going to talk about her newly minted book from Stanford University Press. I understand this is also a first book discussion after the book launch a week ago, you said? So welcome. The Hague program is a friendly and great place to kick things off. Hopefully, it will be an auspicious start for you. Lucie is going to speak about her book, Cyber Sovereignty: The Future of Governance in Cyberspace. By way of background, she is a postdoctoral researcher at the Peace Research Center at Charles University in Prague, and she also has some experience in the private sector, which I think she's better suited to sort of brief you in about over the course of the presentation. And since we already have enough people in the room already, without further ado, Lucie, please take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Arun, and thank you, Korean, for having me, for the invitation. It's a real honor, and as Arun mentioned, this is my very first talk after the book launch approximately a month ago. So please bear with me, and let's dive into it straight away. As Arun mentioned, my background is both in academia and in practice. So I finished my PhD 3 years ago, and now I'm pursuing a postdoctoral research, focusing mainly on the non-technical aspects of cybersecurity, primarily state sovereignty. But I'm also I also worked in practice. Currently, I'm focusing on cyber threat intelligence in private sector, but previously I also worked on the cybersecurity topics in international organizations such as NATO, but also in, for instance, the Czech National Cybersecurity Authority. So I'm mentioning this at the beginning of the talk because the book reflects both of these experiences. So what you can actually find in this book is both the point of view of an academician, so a little bit of theoretical point of view, but also the point of view of a practitioner. So I try to combine these two hats, which I've worn for the past years. Now, let's see if the slides will work. The first thing what comes to mind when you see the book might be, what's the relevance of state sovereignty in cyberspace? Why you should actually, read this book? Why you should be interested in this topic? State sovereignty has been with us basically almost 400 years, since the Peace of Westphalia. That's the kind of like official beginning of how we date state sovereignty in 1648. But since then, state sovereignty as a concept, as a cornerstone of international law and international relations, has transformed. Basically, depending on the state, the state governance, the state regime, how states behaved and approached it. Now, I'm not going to dive into the evolution of state sovereignty as a concept. For that, I wrote a chapter in the book, so feel free to to go through that if you're not familiar with the transformation of state sovereignty. But what I want to emphasize is that throughout this transformation of state sovereignty as a concept, it still kept the fundamental idea. And that is that state sovereignty is the the supreme authority, which is exercised within a distinct territorial jurisdiction that is free from foreign interference. But at the same time, it has its place in the international system. And this is very important to keep in mind, because really this is the idea which the state sovereignty kept throughout the centuries. Now, what I argue in the book in relations to cyberspace is that we are currently in an exploratory phase when governments try to push the boundaries of state sovereignty in cyberspace and explore how far they can go, but still stay within the democratic boundaries. So in the book, I really focus primarily on democracies. And different governments give different labels to sovereignty. It can be digital, technological, network sovereignty, internet sovereignty, and so on and so on. But what I really focus is the concept of state sovereignty in the broad understanding, in the comprehensive understanding in cyberspace. And I try to explain a modern point of view on this classical concept. Now, again, going back to my background, in the book, you will find bits and pieces which focus on theory. So I actually focus on how our understanding of sovereignty has changed in its latest development phase, and that is cyberspace. But then I also cover a lot of topics which are interesting for practitioners. So, for instance, sovereignty, there are multiple types of sovereignty. I will talk about it in a minute. And there are also different ways how to practice state sovereignty in cyberspace. And so I'm looking into the complexness and variability of exercising state sovereignty. For instance, what kind of tools states use in order to exercise state sovereignty in cyberspace, and what kind of out-of-the-box solutions they are looking for. Now, to do that, I ask three questions. The key research questions which I ask in my book is: how does state practice of sovereignty in cyberspace change the traditional understanding of the concept, as I mentioned before? But then, to answer this key or main research question, I also go into two working questions. One is related to the tools which states use or employ to exercise state sovereignty in cyberspace. And the other one relates to the differences between how states exercise authority and control outside of cyberspace and in cyberspace, because authority and control are two key elements of state sovereignty as a concept. Now, to do that, to frame this research question and overall the book in a theoretical grounding, I would say, I use typology of state sovereignty by Professor Stephen Krasner. Why I use this typology, it's because Stephen Krasner really defined four types of state sovereignty, which encompass different activities of states in relations to state sovereignty outside of cyberspace, in the physical world, in relation to the four traditional domains of sea, land, air, and space. But I believe that this comprehensive typology can also be transferred into cyberspace to describe the different activities which cyberspace offers to the states. Now, as I mentioned, there are 4 types which Stephen Krasner defines in its typology. It's Westphalian sovereignty, international legal sovereignty, domestic sovereignty, and interdependent sovereignty, but I will not go into them at this point because they are part of the presentation of the talk a little bit later. But just for you to know that there are these 4 types. What is at this point even more important is authority and control. So I've already mentioned that they play an important role, that there are 2, I would say, key components of state sovereignty in general. And they actually, later on in my book, also constitute 2 key variables, which I study throughout the case studies in my book. That's why it is important to also, define them. So according to Stephen Krasner, authority is the mutually acknowledged right for actors to become involved in specific activities. So what I would really, underline here is the acknowledged right of the states to act or to behave in a certain way. And then the control is defined as attainable through the simple use of brute force without a need for mutually recognized authority. Here, the key term is use of brute force. Now, I mentioned that I use these 2 as key variables in my book, the key elements which I study in the use case or in the case studies. And so I had to find how to mirror these 2 variables in cyberspace. And it wasn't that easy because, for instance, with control, it is hard to use brute force in cyberspace, right? So I actually had to find a little bit of a proxy to mirror it in this domain, and that's why, in relation to control, I look into what cyber capabilities and capacities the states need in order to exercise the particular type of state sovereignty. Interestingly enough, you will see that the cyber capabilities do not need to be owned purely by the state, but they can be also owned, for instance, by private sector. And then in terms of the authority, I really look into domestic laws and international legal actions, which the states, again, need to take in order to exercise that particular state sovereignty. Now, I mentioned that I have several case studies. Each of the type of state sovereignty defined by Stephen Krasner is matched with one case study. Again, I will not go deep into this because that's the topic of the next few minutes. But just that you know, I look into Westphalian sovereignty and the use and its projection in cyberspace through the case study of Estonia and data embassies. International legal sovereignty is matched with the Netherlands and its active role in international cyber negotiations. Domestic sovereignty, I study through the Turkish approach to internet regulations, and then interdependent sovereignty, I look into the US and their approach towards Huawei and also other Chinese companies and their access to the US market and its critical infrastructure. Now, what is important here is actually the countries themselves, because as I mentioned, we are in an exploratory phase when states are trying to the limits of state sovereignty in cyberspace. And I actually look only at democracies and only at democracies in the transatlantic area. Now, why is that? If you take a look into how state sovereignty is defined and the history of state sovereignty, in democracies, it's usually the will of the people who give the authority to the government to rule, right? To exercise state sovereignty. That's why I'm looking into democracies, because democracies so far has been understudied in relations to state sovereignty. We have a lot of literature on, authoritarian state, China, Russia, and so on, how they exercise state sovereignty, but not that much on democracy. So that's why I focus on democracies. And why transatlantic area? Because the democracies in transatlantic area have a similar understanding of cyberspace, of cybersecurity issues. They have close bilateral relations. They are members of the same international organizations which deal with cybersecurity issues and so on. So that's why I opted for this scope of the case studies. Now, going forward, I'm moving to the case studies themselves. So first, I mentioned Westphalian sovereignty, the I would say most famous type of sovereignty, which is usually talked about in general, and Estonia. If you take a look at the Krasner's definition of Westphalian sovereignty, you will see that it's based on two principles, and that's territoriality and the exclusion of external actors from domestic authority structure. Now, when you think about how to transfer this idea into cyberspace and what's the state practice which relates to these two principles, you immediately think about the state's effort to preserve confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of governmental data. And an excellent example on that, or a case study actually, in cyberspace is the concept of data embassies developed by Estonia. You might know that Estonia is one of the most digitalized states in the world. Actually, all its government data are stored in cloud. And what is absolutely key for Estonian state is to preserve its digital continuity. So basically, whatever happens to Estonia as a state located in the Baltics, it has to keep running online so that its citizens and e-citizens as well can still take advantage of the governmental services. And so Estonia was very transparent in exploring the how to preserve their digital continuity, and they published several studies, even in cooperation with private sector and so on. And in the end, they opted for the concept of data embassies, which are basically data centers which are located outside of Estonian territory, which are owned by another state, an allied state in a safe geolocation, I would say. And which, however, the Estonian government or the Estonian state has a unique access to. In this case, Estonia decided to negotiate this kind of agreement as a pilot project with Luxembourg, because Luxembourg is a very progressive country with a safe location in the center of Europe, and with the highest standard of data centers in the world. And so in 2017, Estonia signed a bilateral agreement with Luxembourg in order to host its data and information systems in the data centers owned by Luxembourg. And that's why also I'm looking into, in terms of my variables, into authority and control. In terms of authority, although I'm in the chapter exploring both domestic laws and international law or the bilateral agreement, I come to the conclusion that actually the international or the bilateral agreement with Luxembourg is the key authority in this type of state sovereignty in relations to Estonia. And then in terms of the control, I'm looking into the infrastructure which Estonian government needs in order to run the data embassy based in Luxembourg. So I'm looking really into the X-Road data exchange layer, the keyless signature infrastructure, but also into the highest standard of the data center and so on. If you are an international lawyer, I really recommend to take a look at this bilateral agreement between Estonia and Luxembourg. It's interesting in the way that although we are talking about data embassies, the data centers do not have a status of a diplomatic mission in the sense of international law. But I would say that the label data embassy is more like marketing label almost. Actually, the bilateral agreement doesn't even mention the term data embassy at all. But it is based on Vienna Convention, on the diplomatic missions, and so on. So it actually builds upon the international law which protects and governs the diplomatic missions abroad. In terms of the infrastructure, I already mentioned, for instance, the X-Roads. So the X-Road is a data exchange layer which allows Estonian government to exchange information between different institutions, because in Estonia there is not one database which would collect all the data, but there are different databases which the institutions can request information from among each other. And this X-Road data exchange layer is there actually to exchange this kind of data in the most secure way possible. So moving on to the next case study, I look into the international legal sovereignty and the Netherlands. So when you take a look at the definition of international legal sovereignty, you can see that it is based on the mutual recognition of rights to take part in international law or in international relations and so on. In cyberspace, states usually already who exercise the international legal sovereignty, they usually enter already as a recognized state. So they do not need to seek the international legal recognition. But really what is key here is how they approach the international legal sovereignty. Do they exercise it? In what way? Or if they don't, why? So I really look into how, in this case, the Netherlands approaches its international legal sovereignty through the actions and initiatives during the international negotiations on cyber issues. Because there can be states which decide to take part only in certain negotiations which are, important for them. Or on the other hand, such as Netherlands, you can really go in different forums which are already existing, or you can even try to establish new activities, new initiatives, and you can try to push your point of view, your negotiation through those. Now, again, if I take a look at my variables, authority and control, I look into the infrastructure, which the Netherlands calls Digital Gateway to Europe. So the Digital Gateway to Europe is basically an infrastructure based on the Dutch territory, which consists of different elements such as internet exchange points, but also, for instance, a very dense network of data centers and so on. And I look into how this infrastructure influences the negotiations or the negotiation position of the Netherlands. Because one of the key elements which the Netherlands usually pushes in the international negotiations is, for instance, the core of the internet, protection of the core of the internet. And it is actually motivated exactly by this infrastructure, which is located on the Dutch territory. Now, in terms of the authority, I look into the various initiatives and activities during international negotiations on cyber related issues. So I really look into a broad topics from the UN group of governmental experts and the role which the Netherlands play there. I look into the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, or, for instance, the Hague process, which the Netherlands initiated and hosted during the drafting of the Tallinn Manual 2.0. Now, moving on to Turkey, I matched Turkey with the domestic sovereignty because domestic sovereignty is basically based on two elements, and that's formal organization of political authority and the effective exercise of control within the borders of their policy. And I look in relation to this case study at the internet regulations in Turkey up till the 2016 military coup. Why I limit the case study by this year? It's because up till 2016, Turkey was, according to the Freedom House, but also other NGOs, still recognized as a free or partially free country. So we can still, put them in this democracy basket. But after that, it can be questionable whether Turkey can still belong under this label. And so I really look on this time period between 2007 and 2016 and how Turkey exercised its state-centric or state control approach to internet and internet regulations. In terms of authority, I look on the legislative framework for internet restrictions, in particular the law number 5651, which is a law on publications on the internet and combating crimes committed by means of such publications. So basically a law which was originally in 2007 adopted to protect families, to protect children, and in general vulnerable citizens of Turkey from harmful content online. But throughout the years, it became a tool of the government how to exercise filtering, blocking, banning content, but also services online. Especially after 2014 and 2015 amendments to this law, the law became really a tool of the government, which they used against content unfavorable to the governmental policy. Now, in terms of the control, I'm looking really at how the public authorities effectively exercise this internet restrictions, and I'm in particular looking at two institutions, and that is the BTK, the Information and Communications Technologies Authority, and its division or subdivision, which is the Presidency of Telecommunication and Communications. Which basically really enforced these internet restrictions. And if you take a look, for instance, at the statistics and so on, you can see that towards this 2016 or like during also protest in the Gezi Park and so on, the restrictions were tougher and tougher, and that is also illustrated in the available statistics and so on. Now, moving to the last case study, being conscious of the time as well, it's the interdependent sovereignty and the US. Here, this type of sovereignty is really based on the regulation of transborder movement. Stephen Krasner defines the transborder movement of different things such as information, ideas, goods, people, pollutants, and so on. In cyberspace, we can of course talk about the regulation of transborder movement of information, but that's not really usually the case of democracies. And so I'm looking really at the transborder movement of goods, but actually more better to say supply chain. And so I'm looking into the US approach towards Chinese telecommunications companies and their attempt to enter the US market. Here in particular, I focus on Huawei, although I also mention ZTE and some other Chinese telcos companies. And I study it through the government's administrative and legislative actions, which prevented Huawei from entering the US market. Here, it can be actually tracked back to the year 2012, when the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence published a report warning the government entities against potentially dangerous Chinese telecommunication companies, in particular Huawei and ZTE. But the true peak of that campaign, I would say, came during the first administration of President Trump in 2018 and later. But then I also, I don't actually focus only on the national level, but I go a step farther and I follow the US outreach campaign abroad, because not only that the US actually implemented this administrative and legislative actions on the national domestic level, but they came up with a clean network campaign, which was a campaign targeting their allies globally, trying to persuade them to opt out and really not use the Huawei technologies in their critical infrastructure. In terms of control, here I focus on the US government's approach to building their critical infrastructure. In particular, I focus on the telecommunication infrastructure and the 5G tech standard, which was critical at the time of negotiations or the campaign against Huawei, with the ultimate goal to retain the US technology superiority. Now, I'm going to the conclusion, and because I've covered quite a lot, but still not enough to also introduce you the whole conclusions of the book. For that, you will need to read it. I'm sorry. But I still want to cover a little bit, or the key points, both again going to the theory and practice. So I want to cover at least like 4 points for each. So in terms of theory, what I believe you could take out of this is that at this point we are really in a period of moving boundaries of state sovereignty in cyberspace. States are trying their limits in terms of state sovereignty in cyberspace. They are exploring it. It's a very exciting time, and states are are trying to come up with new solutions to that. Based on the study of authority and control throughout the case studies, you can also find out that the dynamics of authority and control in cyberspace is very different from the physical world, because Stephen Krasner says that each sovereignty type is based on different dynamics of authority and control. I studied this dynamics also in cyberspace, and I come to a conclusion. And again, to see how the dynamics changes, you have to take a look into the book. But I come to the conclusion that the dynamics of authority and control per the sovereignty type is very different between cyberspace and non-cyber environment. For that reason, states must also approach state sovereignty in cyberspace in a more complex manner, because what I found out in the study of authority and control is that these two variables are much more interconnected in cyberspace than outside of cyberspace. So international legal framework and the cyber capabilities are very much interconnected in cyberspace, more than the authority and control outside of cyberspace. And then, as you will see when looking at the tools which states use for exercise of state sovereignty, you will see that the tools are much more flexible, creative, and states actually come up with out-of-the-box solutions. And that is not only in terms of technology. That kind of moves me to the 4 points, 4 concluding points on the practice. And I try to actually, highlight at least one, I would say, point taken from each of the case studies. So what Estonia taught us, or the case study of Estonia, is that innovation in cyberspace doesn't mean just the technical innovation. You can, again, in your mind, go back to the bilateral agreement between Estonia and Luxembourg, which is a very innovative way of moving forward the international law in cyberspace. It's an unprecedented bilateral agreement. In terms of the Netherlands, the lesson learned is that the multi-stakeholder model of negotiations, which the Netherlands is promoting, is not just about the negotiations with your allies, but in order to agree really on the basics of cybersecurity norms, for instance, you really have to include also those stakeholders outside of your ally contacts, I would say. And here I'm not talking only about states, but also about non-state actors. Then in terms of the Turkey, the lesson learned is that, at least from my point of view, that the state should really strictly stick to the system of checks and balances. Turkey exercised, as I mentioned, state control or state-centric approach to state sovereignty in cyberspace. Here, I would say that the system of checks and balances prevents the misuse of public authorities' powers over the regulations online or on the internet. And then, last but not least, the lesson learned, or the conclusions from one of the conclusions from the interdependent sovereignty case, is that although finances or money is an important factor of cybersecurity, it should definitely not be the most decisive one. Because if you compare, for instance, Huawei to some other providers, we know that Huawei is competitive thanks to its low prices. but that shouldn't be the main factor how states choose their supply chain provider, or the provider for its manufacturer for its critical infrastructure. Now, that would be it from me. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the questions.